Knew he was dying. He had injected double his normal amount of drugs into his vein, felt like his heart exploded out of his chest, and in those split seconds between life and death, Larry did something he never expected. He cried out to God.
Senior pastor of New Beginnings Church in Bedford, Texas, Larry Hutch, grew up in an abusive home. For years, his father's physical and emotional violence left him struggling with anger and rage. As a young man, Larry began selling drugs and eventually became a full-blown addict. Then, he had a spiritual awakening that changed his life. In his book, From Junkie to Jerusalem, Larry shares how he left his addictions behind, embraced his faith in Christ, and began fulfilling God's destiny for his life.
I'm thrilled Larry is with us now. Larry, welcome to 700
Thank you, sir. Honored to be here.
I have seen you preach, teach, talk about prophecy, the Middle East, Israel on TV many times, but I was stunned at your story, your testimony.
Yeah.
Incredible. And it starts with your very difficult childhood, right? Tell us about that.
Well, I grew up in inner city South St. Louis. I was in the hood, and which in itself is, not necessarily going to guide your path, but and I say this about my dad because my dad, right before he passed away, he received the Lord, and so it's in no way blaming him. But my dad was a mean guy. My dad was a mean guy, and he would beat. I watched him beat my mom. He'd beat us. He knocked him when I was a young little boy, knocked me out, and then kicked me through the house and broke all my ribs. And I think the breaking point was I came home. I was probably about 7, 8 years old, and I can remember. We lived in a home that was 800 square feet, all the kids and everything. And I walked in, and I can still see it. Walking in the back door, my dad's back was to us. He was on the phone, and he was trying to give me away. And he said, I don't want him. He was trying to get a home to come and take me. And I remember thinking, okay, my dad's a pretty mean guy, but he doesn't want me. And I remember going into my room and crying. And I was probably 7, 8 years old, something like that. And I said, my dad doesn't want me. And then I caught myself, and I said, nobody will ever make me cry again. Mm-hmm. And I became very hardened, and I would watch my dad and see how mean he was. And I came home from college one time. My little sister's eye was all swollen. I mean, it's just I knocked the plate off the floor one time when we're eating dinner. Our kitchen was about this big, and we were messing around, and I knocked the plate on the floor, and he made me eat the food off the floor without my hands. And but the thing that got me was, and it really became evident that something was deeply wrong with me, and I became just like my dad. A lot of times we talk about the drug addiction, and I was a drug addict. I became a drug addict. I was smuggling drugs I was one of the first ones that Escobar started working with when he first started going. I lived in his town. I was in his cabs.
Because you became a drug user, right? To cope, and you're a tough dude.
Yeah.
Football player.
Yeah.
But then you find out you can make some real money selling drugs.
Yeah, and I don't know if people can understand this, but in all that I was doing, I knew there was a God. When we were 11, 12 years old, we'd stay out in the streets, all South St. Louis. We'd stay out in the streets all night long. We'd go to a Catholic church at like 5 in the morning, because it was open for Mass, to get out of the cold. And I'd be in there and I'd say, wow, is there a God out there? And in all that I was doing, and I know it sounds crazy, I knew there was a God. I just never thought of looking for him in church. And later, I was selling drugs to people that went to church, that called themselves Christians. And so deep inside of me, I wanted to know who God was. But I never thought if there was a God that he would have anything to do with somebody like me.
Well, you're like a drug kingpin in Colombia, in dangerous situations, faced death a few times.
Yeah.
How did you break out of that part of your life?
Well, we kind of said in the same way that I overdosed on drugs. I was by myself. We had a ranch up in the mountains. And when I collapsed, I knew I was dying. I knew I'd overdosed. And I cried out, God, help me. And I didn't cry out because I was afraid of going to hell, because I didn't believe in hell. And I'm a pretty tough guy. I can handle whatever happens. But I said these words. I said, God, don't let me die until I find what happiness is. And I love to tell people, I was sharing this story last Sunday in church in Dallas. And while I was there, one of my pastors told me afterwards, he said, J.D. Vance was watching the whole program from Air Force Two. But I was sharing it because we had a whole bunch of guys from the streets, Teen Challenge there, and I wanted them to know that Jesus is more than getting us to heaven. He's come to give us life and life more abundant. And I was a drug addict. I was extremely violent. I'd done things I've never told anybody. And yet inside of me, inside of every one of us, we can say we're agnostic. We can say, I don't believe the Bible. I'm an atheist. But the moment something happens that is out of our control, God has put a button in our spirit and we go, God help me. And that's because he doesn't care where we're coming from. He's there. He wants to help us. And when I cried out in Colombia, South America, I can look back and watch God orchestrate. I came back to the United States, found out there were 7 federal warrants out for my arrest. I've been selling to an undercover narcotics agent. Looked like a hippie, looked like us. And so I look at that, and I love to tell people when I found out they were going to arrest me, I thought I was running from the long arms of the law, but what I was really doing is running right into the strong arms of the Lord.
So what, did he speak to you? I mean, you were prophesied over, weren't you, back in these United States?
Yeah, well, I ran to Flagstaff, Arizona, and I'm with 2 girls, and I have long hair and still using needle marks and using heroin and cocaine. And I'm sitting on my porch, and earrings, before earrings were in, and I'm sitting on my porch smoking a joint, and this little Hispanic guy keeps walking back and forth across the street, and I'm thinking, well, he's going to come over and ask if I got any drugs for sale. And he does this 5 or 6 times, and so I'm just sitting there watching him, and he gets to the end of the block, takes a deep breath, turns around, and walks right up to me. And I'm thinking he's going to buy some drugs. And he said, I've never done this before, but I couldn't leave until I told you Jesus is who you're looking for. And I said, what? Come on. And so, long story short, he kept coming over, and I'd smoke dope in front of him. He lived right next to me with his mom. And finally, he got me to go to church, and because it was a Johnny Cash movie. And I watched it, and at the end of the Johnny Cash movie called Gospel Road, it shows Jesus dying on the cross. Now, I have no church background. I know nothing about being born again, heaven, hell, Christianity. I have no idea. And it shows Jesus dying on the cross at Calvary. And it moved me. I knew somehow it was real. And then it showed Jesus, the same moments, the same movements, the same music, but this time he's dying on the cross, and it was Times Square with a bunch of homeless and prostitutes. And then it showed him East LA, dying there, with drug addicts and gangbangers. And somehow I knew, I didn't understand anything about the Bible, but I knew he did this for me, even though I was who I was. And so I still to this day don't know how I got to the altar. It was a church of about 50 people. I'm down at the altar, and nobody in the church prayed with us. They all walked around us. And I finally said, God, if you're real, be real to me. And remember, I said, nobody will ever make me cry. And I felt like 1,000,000 pounds lifted off of me.
Well, and that, because of what you went through, your background, your history, you ministered in passionate ways to drug addicts,
Yes.
Homeless,
Yeah.
jails,
Yeah.
right?
Prisons all over the world.
Planted churches. You got such a story. We don't have enough time for everything, but your jail ministry. I mean, the churches you planted. God has used you in an incredible way, and I know you're humbled by what you went through. I mean, there you are. I mean, look at what incredible.
Yeah. And now I have the privilege. The next couple of weeks, I'll be in Israel. I'll be with President Herzog, probably with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I've sat with President Trump. And so that's why we wrote From Junkie to Jerusalem, because we wanted to tell people, if all Jesus did was forgive us, and you can, I don't care how deep a hole you're in, his love is deeper. But when you give your life to Jesus, he's got a destiny for you beyond anything you can imagine.
Let's also say, though, your family has still gone through a lot of health concerns.
Yeah.
You, your wife, your grandson. Can you briefly touch on how you're getting through, what's going on and how your faith is going your family?
Well, part of it is Genesis 12:3. God says, I'll bless those who bless Israel. And I'm with the Israeli Ally Foundation, and we had written the policy to help President Trump in his first election get elected, of moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And we were over there for the moving of the embassy, and my son called and he said, Dad, we need to pray. Lion's real sick. And Lion was our 7-month-old grandson. Long story short, we get back and he was diagnosed with an incurable leukemia. And they said no child's ever survived this kind of leukemia. They called us back in about 3 weeks later and said, we checked with the heads of Children's Hospital all over the world before we called you in. Lion has a gene in him that there is no medical history anywhere in the world, a child his age having this gene. And it's a miracle. They said it's a miracle. And so he went through the treatment and everything, and they said, but because of the treatment, he'll probably never be able to learn. He's in 2nd grade now. They've just tested him. He's literally a genius. Photographic memory, pitch perfect, picks up an instrument, plays it. I mean, it's a miracle of miracles. And during that same time, my wife, Tiz, was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And we sat in the office almost 7 years ago, and they said, we think we can give you 3 months. And 4 times now, they've sent her home and said, there's nothing left. Well, what do? You go home and die. And every time God has intervened, and she's right now in LA, she's the first one getting this treatment. You would never know anything's wrong with her. They're thrilled. The doctor came in, the head of the hospital in LA, City of Hope, came in and said, Tiz, you're a miracle. And she said, you guys have saved my life. And the doctor said, we did not. Only he could have done this. And so it's a testimony. We do a lot with Israel. We do a lot with leaders of Israel all over the world. And it's a testimony to them to see the power of God that has walked my family through, not only me, but my family through impossible situations.
Friends, this book is called From Junkie to Jerusalem, and it is extremely compelling and will supercharge your faith. It's incredible what God does in the lives of people. Larry, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Really appreciate it. And God bless your family.
Thank you, sir.
Again, it's called From Junkie to Jerusalem. Terry, over to you.